Hey everybody, Tony D with a hot take on arguing economics on Reddit. Reddit is definitely Reddit. It should be read it. Um, the people on Reddit, a lot of them, don't really understand economics. There's a handful that do. Every once in a while I run into a libertarian or someone in the libertarian mix who knows economics way better than I do and calls me out on some nuances that I'll never fully understand. But for the most part, when you're arguing with just your average schmo, they don't really get economics. So we were in a Reddit thread. It was an announcement that Trump is slashing regulations in order that companies can compete here and make our drugs again, because something like 95% of our basic drugs are made in China because they're so cheap. And I said that's a good thing. That's a good thing. These other guys who are huge Bernie fans, I think, were excoriating me and Trump and saying, "Oh my God, what are you mad? Trump's an idiot. This is just obviously going to benefit the man," and blah blah blah. Same old usual sort of socialist arguments, and from some people who don't consider themselves socialist, but they're really arguing from a position of not really understanding the basics of economics. And I made a declaratory statement in the thread. I said price controls don't work. Well, they challenged me to prove that. And it's like, how do you prove a negative, number one, other than you can point to socialist countries who have price controls and say, but that's, I knew, wouldn't be good enough for these guys because they don't adhere to any sort of reason or logic, and they're not going to argue that point fairly because they'll say, well, blah 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 blah. That you can't point at Venezuela because really there's other variables, blah blah blah. Suddenly there's other variables. And then they force you again to defend yourself over and over and over, and they never argue the point, which is price controls don't work. But the interesting turn of phrase one of the guys said was, by what authority do you say that? Which is interesting because to me it betrays sort of the left's economic vision, which is you need an authority to tell you what's right. You need an authority. I need someone who's strong and powerful in the world, who's approved by the collective in order to say, yes, this must be right. See, this is Paul Krugman. He's won lots of awards. He must be right on economics, even though Krugman's been wrong a bunch of times. See his article on babysitter coupons in his building. That's a particularly egregious example of how stupid Krugman is in his own way about creating a system. He couldn't even create a system of babysitter coupons in the building without effing it up. I don't think he created it, but he didn't understand why it didn't work. But that's a side note. So price controls don't work, and they want me to show my math. But I kind of can't do that, and I kind of don't want to because, I know where this is going. It's going down the rabbit hole of I don't know what I'm talking about because I don't have an expert behind me saying, yes, he's right, listen to him. I just know sort of basic economics. So I'll explain to you some basic economics of why price controls wouldn't work. So I'll explain it in comics because that's a sphere that I worked in, and I set the prices of my comics. I made comics, and I was a publisher, and I had to figure out what the price was. And I based that price based on what the marketplace was doing, based on how much it cost me to print the comic and the talent and whatnot. And that's how I set the price, because I wanted to make a profit on the comic, and for a short time I did. So if you came in with price controls in the comic book industry, say, well, you'd have to say before the pandemic, because now everything's all messed up. So let's use pre-pandemic numbers. The comic books right now, the average one is selling, brace yourself, $4 a comic. Yeah, I know, it's high. So let's say you came in and said, no, that's too high a price. We're going to put a price control on it. Well, first off, who controls it? Obviously, you're talking about the government, right? Or some government entity would come in and force the comic book stores, well, you can only sell comics for $2 a pop. To which the comic book stores would go, oh my God, $2? That's what I pay for to get the comic. I pay almost $2 for this comic. That's not enough profit margin for me to operate my business. So they'd go to the distributor and they'd say, listen, they're making me pay $2 a comic. You got to sell this thing to me for $1. And the distributor would go, oh my God, $1? That's what I pay for these comics. I pay about $1. And they'd go, well, let me call the publisher, see if we can work something out. And they'd call the publisher up and they'd say, listen, I got to sell your comics now for half the price. I got to sell them at like $1. So can you cut your price to 50 cents? And the publisher would say, my God, are you crazy? It costs us about 50 cents to make these comics. So if you made it law, which is the only way you could force this, really, you would put these people in a situation where lots of people would lose their jobs. Because just because you say something should be $2 doesn't magically make it so. They have to cut the cost. The money has to come from somewhere. So the obvious thing to do would be to cut out the distributor. That would cut out a big chunk of the money. But the distributor would lose his job, all the people who worked for him, the warehouse would close up, and poof, just like that, you'd put all these people out of business. But that still wouldn't be enough because the publisher would still have to take on the overhead of shipping. It would be less because they got rid of a separate entity who needed profit on its own, and you would be, condensing it all into one entity that gets a profit, but you would still have overhead to take care of. So the comic book publisher would be forced to cut back on quality. That would be, they could cut some of the rates of their freelancers, although they've cut them pretty close to the bone already. But the easiest thing to do would be to print them not in color. See, then they could fire their colorist. It's cheaper to print black and white comics, and you could probably make that price point work from there on in. The problem with that, of course, is the printer would now make less money. So now they would be forced to cut some of their overhead or raise their prices, in which case it would go back to the publisher to fire even more people. So let's just say that the printer goes, oh, okay, black and white now. Well, I guess I could fire 6 or 7 people because now we don't have to go through the color process. It's a little cheaper, and I could cut back. So everybody would be cutting back. Now you would get the price point down to $1 a comic, so you could sell it to the stores, and they could sell it for $2. They keep their profit margin, right? Wrong. Now they've got a product that's half the price. They're only making half the money on it. They got to sell twice as many. Unfortunately, black and white comics are not as appealing as color comics. So they lose some of their customer base. Now, some of their customer base says, ooh, cheap comics, and buys more. But a lot of them just walk away and go, screw this. I'll buy Japanese comics through the internet. I don't need this. So you've essentially tanked an entire industry. It was tanking anyway. But you've essentially used the government to tank an entire industry while helping it. You've helped no one because all you've done is distorted the marketplace and made a lot of people go through a lot of trouble that didn't make any sense to begin with. It's not going to suddenly you can't just make something that's $4, $2. There are many organic reasons why comic books are $4. Now, I personally think they're too expensive, and I think there is a business model somewhere to get the price down to $2. But that requires innovation from within the industry, not from without, from politicians who don't really understand it. And certainly not from Redditors who don't understand the very basics of economics, of how to set a price for things, why competition drives down price. See, that's another thing too. If competition, and there's really not much competition in the marketplace of comics these days, it could drive down the price. But you also need a business that's thriving and growing, and the comic book industry is not. It's not a thriving and growing business right now. It's one that's taking it on the chin. So the Redditors who are trying to push, their knowledge, which really is just the status quo. It's really just their basic sort of 8th grade high school knowledge of things. They don't know what they're talking about. So they argue, how to kill the messenger rather than the message. Because to actually argue economics in the United States, well, it's a sad state of affairs. People just don't get it. It's numbers. It's math. And, the moment you start talking about profit and companies making a profit, people go, oh, they're making too much money. Yeah, maybe, but there's certainly examples of excesses in the marketplace, but often those excesses are punished by online stuff like this, truly excessive ones. But most of them are not excessive. Most businesses, if they are unregulated or lightly regulated, they tend to be all about price and service. And when you mix in other distortions of the marketplace, that's where you get these ridiculous bubbles. One of the reasons comic books are so high is because comic books don't really need to make any money anymore. They have both of the major 2 superhero branches have become arms of major motion pictures, and they, especially Marvel, don't really care about their numbers anymore. They don't care about their sales. They're not, in my view, responsive to their market. And that was created by corporations. Now, but the initial problems, what brought these 2 big companies into providence was actually government interfering in the marketplace. Not price controls, but if you go back to the 50s with the juvenile delinquency hearings, which pulled in comics, it destroyed their competition. It destroyed EC Comics, the guys who made Tales from the Crypt, some of the greatest comics considered to ever put to paper. And the only thing that came out of that, the only thing that survived that great purge was Mad Magazine, which in the end ended up at DC Comics, one of the competitors that helped that whole mess, come along. So when you get government involved, then the big companies go to government and say, hey, you want to be reelected next time? Help us destroy our competition and win on this particular issue. And then they influence the government, and you get the exact opposite of what you want. So if you want to ask the government for price controls, all they're going to do is create a price that is beneficial for the guys who are already dominating the market to squeeze out anybody else who can't afford to pay for lobbyists or to throw 500 grand towards some senators or presidential campaign. So don't ask for price controls. They don't work, and that's why. Understand?